Hi dudes and dudettes, it's me, E07, and this is another edition of The Radical Reset. Today, we're going to talk about education, a very timely subject because in this world of COVID that we're in, schooling has become disrupted and is probably, as it was with healthcare that I just recently discussed, an appropriate time to go over what is and is not the proper course of education. We're going to divide, in discussing Antipolitism's position on education, we're going to divide education into two parts. K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, in other words, graduating from high school. And then separately, I'm going to discuss college. And I'm going to go through it quickly again, because I don't like these podcasts to last much more than 30 minutes. But all of this is laid out in great detail in A Radical Reset, the Manifesto of Antipolitism. As I often say, available to you free to download if you have a Kindle and are a Prime member, or you can buy the paperback. Take your pick. Okay, let's start with K-12 education. Now, originally in the United States, all education was local and private. Okay, public schools were developed. Believe it or not, this is just a little history. Back into the early 1800s, there was a group of people in the state of Massachusetts and then in New England in general, which at the time was the locus, not locust, locus, in other words, the focal point of government and culture in the United States at that point in history. And they were called the Know-Nothings. Now, the Know-Nothings, and they literally called them, well, they didn't call themselves Know-Nothings, but they were called popularly the Know-Nothings, and they were vehemently anti-Catholic. Now, you would think that the purpose of public education would be to educate children, but in fact, the idea was for the local government to take it over, to get rid of kids going to Catholic schools and reduce the influence of what they used to call popery. I mean, I don't know. As a Jewish boy, what do I know? I will tell you that my children, all four of them, went to Catholic high school, and it was a good experience. But that's how public education in the United States started. And then from that point forward, all the way through the rest of the 19th century and all of the 20th century until we get to the 1960s, the decade of destruction, as I like to call it, it remained a local issue. And how public schools were always funded was, and should be, well, to some extent still is, local property taxes. So if you owned a house within a school district or a piece of property within a school district, you pay property taxes, and theoretically at least, those property taxes go to fund public schools. Now, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, who started the Great Society program, began meddling in education, but it really came to its ultimate fruition in 1979, where one of the last things that Jimmy Carter did as president was sign into existence the Federal Department of Education. Now, at that point, education was ripped away from the local school boards. Yes, they still exist, but their power was largely removed. They were castrated of most of their power, and the responsibility went to the federal government. And then since that time, presidents and Congresses, Democrat and Republican, have continued this process because special interest depends on it. Understand that the teachers union is a very powerful union. And by federalizing the education process, they were able to focus their attention on one place to get money instead of the hundreds and thousands of school districts across the country. Instead of having to worry about trying to get power in all of those places, it's so much simpler if you have one place to attack. And believe me, I'm not being cynical when I say this. The only purpose for the Federal Department of Education is so that the teachers' unions and special interests that relate to education have one place to go and feed off the federal tit. Now, education since that time, I think any reasonable person listening to me and watching me now would say, has gotten nothing but worse since the time of the federalization of education. And if you talk to any union teacher, public school teacher, they will say to you that the problem is money. We always, last year before this whole COVID thing, I think you all remember the red shirt protests and for some reason, by screaming, it's the children, people lose sight of the fact that this has nothing to do with the children. Let me just tell you that in real dollars, we are spending 8.5 times more per pupil. As I've said many times, the funding of education has gone to 8.5 times what it was in 1979. Even adjusting for inflation, that comes to 2.7 times per pupil that it was in 1979, and education has gotten worse and worse. And more than that, they've imposed federal standards. And not just the Democrats are guilty of this. President Bush had the, I believe, idiotic No Child Left Behind program with national testing and standards, the idea being forcing school districts to perform. Now look, let's take a step back. The purpose of education, the purpose of public education, is not necessarily to educate. What am I talking about? It's not only to educate. Yes, it's to teach reading and writing and arithmetic and STEM and all that other kind of good stuff, but it's also just as much about socialization, learning how to operate as a citizen of the United States theoretically, how to be a good citizen, but it's become essentially an indoctrination system of the political left. So in other words, kids go to school and they don't really get a course. And when I was a kid, let me just back up. When I was a kid, for example, and I went to first private and then public school, it was routine. Western civilization was taught appropriately as the greatest. Today, that just doesn't exist anymore. It's become an indoctrination system of revisionist history and revisionist teaching methods, all to the detriment. And it's broken down society and community standards. It's just as much about today politics as anything else. And millions of parents have voted with their children and have taken them out of the public schools. Anywhere in America where it's available, for example, here in Arizona where I live, we have charter schools. People which are basically publicly funded private schools, state-funded private schools. Any parent that can has taken their children out of public school and put them into every available space in charter schools. They've also been wildly popular in the inner city areas. For example, black parents in poor communities, when there are charter schools available, for example, in the District of Columbia, they are overwhelmingly popular. These parents can't wait to rip their children out of the public schools and place them into private schools. Anywhere private school is available, whether it's a charter school funded by the state or where the people have to pay out of their own pocket, if they can possibly afford it, they have voted with their children. Everybody knows public education K through 12 sucks. So what would an anti-politist legislature do in relationship to public education? And the answer is easy. We would go to entirely charter schools and entirely voucher. In other words, very simply, we would attach the money to the pupil, not to the school district, so that the money followed the child to whatever school they wanted to go. If the money is attached to the pupil, then schools have to compete for students and they have to get better. Now, this, of course, would break the teachers' unions, it would break tenure, and it would result in merit pay and all kinds of experimentation. And the other thing that an anti-political legislature would do is abolish the Federal Department of Education. It's called the Federal Department of Education, but let's be honest, it's really the federal department of where teachers can lobby to get more money, whether or not they deserve it. And given the amount of money that we're spending versus the results that we're getting, who in their right mind would continue to fund this monstrosity? It would be the first federal department I would shut down if I were an anti-politics president together with the anti-politics Congress, and there is no rational argument for a federal department of education or federal standards. As I've said over and over again in other videos, the United States is 50 little countries with open borders, and every state has different demographics and would teach different things. In a agricultural state like, let's say, Kansas, there might be courses in agriculture, where in a state like, in New York City schools, why bother? In other words, let the local school boards decide what the curriculum is, and beyond that, let the local school boards experiment and become little laboratories of what works and doesn't work. And then in the age of the internet and in modern times, it would disseminate to the rest of the country, and other school districts would pick up on it, and other private schools and other charter schools would pick up on it, and schools would get better. The Federal Department of Education and federal standards and testing standards, which just results in teaching to the test guys, and that's just ridiculous too. Anytime you teach to a standard, you end up cheating. I mean, I could go on and on about this. If you want to read more about it, there's a very good chapter in the original book, Freakonomics, on why standardized testing ultimately leads to cheating. Now, If we get rid of the federal Department of Education and we return all control to local school boards and they're funded at the local level, and remember that in an anti-politics system, there's not going to be an income tax, so if additional taxes have to be raised, there's going to be a lot more room to raise them at a local level. The objection to all of this is going to be that it's not going to be equal. You know, schools that are in more wealthy areas will get more funding than schools in poorer areas, as if money was the only factor in dealing with schools. And remember, if the money attaches to the pupil, that means that I'm talking about the state money in particular that attaches to the pupil, that means that a child isn't trapped into one community. So a child could be living in a poor area, but if the parents are willing to schlep them across town, like for example here in Phoenix, there's a really shitty part of town called Sunny Slope. And it's completely across town from another great part of town that you've probably heard of called Scottsdale. Well, in a world where the money attaches to the student, there would be nothing financially stopping a poor parent from taking their children across town and taking them to school in Scottsdale. Now, it would mean 45 minutes on one of the loop freeways that surround Phoenix, and it would be 45 minutes there and 45 minutes back, but that's what parents do. We go through traffic and we sacrifice our time for our kids. And the parents that don't want to do that, well, there's more wrong with their parenting than, traffic. Let me just say, if you're not willing to drive an hour and a half a day to get your children to a better school, really, what kind of parent are you? But we're not here to judge that, because in an anti-political system, it's completely up to you. And besides, equality, if you really think about it, is the cross upon which excellence is nailed. Anytime that people get involved with the discussion of equality, this isn't equal or this isn't fair, excellence gets nailed to the cross. It's crucified at the foot of what is equality? What in life is equal? What is fair? What is the same? What bullshit is this? As long as we attach the money to the pupil, and the pupil can go wherever they want, depending upon how far the parents are willing to drive. They might have to get up early in the morning. They might have to schlep their kids across town. They might have to fight traffic depending on where you live. They might have to ride on trains. They might have to ride on buses. But so what? If the money attaches to the pupil, if the roughly $20,000 a year per pupil that is attached to them through public funding today is attached to them, they can afford to go to private school anywhere they want in any given town or city and get a better education. And if we get the feds out of it and let local districts experiment, we're going to have a better system. That's what we would do about K through 12. Now, let's talk about college a little bit. First of all, today, with our student loan system and bearing people in debt to get degrees, fully 50% of people who start in a four-year college today don't finish. And they don't finish for lots of reasons, but not least among them is they never belonged in college to begin with. So the first thing that an anti-political legislature would do would say to itself, how many kids really belong? What is the purpose in a child going to a four-year institution? And the reason that a lot of them don't belong, by the way, is that, for example, here in the Arizona State University system, University of Arizona, Arizona State University, Northern Arizona University are the three big ones. Fully 50% of the kids that start as freshmen need to go to remedial reading and math classes to be able, to read and do math at the college level, which also points to the failure of public schools, as well as points to kids that just don't belong in college to begin with. Now, I propose that in an anti-political system, upper education would be free, providing that it was merit-based. I'm not talking about the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, forgive all the debts, everybody goes for free, bullshit, handed out, entitlement system. I'm talking about, and this is why anti-politism is pragmatic, I'm talking about, and this is important, by the way, because in order to be participating as a potential congressperson or even president later on, to be in the pool of people that might be selected to serve as a duty, I said long ago in the very first video that I made that this was not an elitist system. And the reason it's not an elitist system is that the road to the elite is open to anyone, and this is the road that's open. So pay attention to what I'm saying. So assuming that you have a minimum of a B average and can get a 75% or better score on SATs or ACTs, depending on what the college requires that you're applying to, state university education should be free. Now, when I say free, your tuition, your books, and that's it. Now, if you're a B plus student, 3.5 or better, okay, and different high schools have different grading systems, but the equivalent of, let's just say, but a 3.5 on a 4-point system, a 3.5 or better average, and score 85% or better on the SATs, then you get a full ride. You get your tuition paid, and you get your computer, and you get your room, and you get your board, the works. Now, I'm saying, in other words, that if you don't have a B average or better, and really to get a 3.0 average in high school, really it's not that tough. You just have to put your head down and do the homework and show up on time and participate in class and do reasonably well on tests. And if you can't do that, I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm saying you don't belong in a four-year university, and you certainly don't belong there funded by the public. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go to a four-year university, but you're going to pay for it out of your own pocket, where there's no way the public should be called upon to fund people who don't belong there to begin with. We've got to put up a threshold of performance. We have to go to a merit-based system, not an entitlement system. Now, what about those kids who aren't B students, who just aren't? Nothing wrong with them. They're good, hardworking kids. They struggle, but really they're C students, okay? For those kids, for those kids who can maintain a 2.5 average or better in high school, which is a C+, which is all we're talking about, and can meet whatever other entry requirements are required by a junior or two-year college, their tuition and books should be paid. Now, not room and board ever, because frankly, most kids who go to two-year colleges live at home with their parents anyway, so they don't need room and board, okay? They can live at home. If they choose not to, then they can get a job and work on the side. Nothing's stopping them. Millions of people have done it before. Millions of people can do it again. And the units, the cost per course hour at a two-year college is much less expensive than at a four-year university. So it's really a good deal for everybody, and they can train into things that are useful. Not everybody is cut out to be, God forbid, a blood-sucking attorney, or to practice medicine, or to become a university professor themselves, or whatever they might choose to be at a four-year level. A lot of kids would be better off becoming medical technicians, computer programmers, code writers. There are lots of things that can be taught and are taught in a two-year college that the public can fund, again, based on merit. But if you're not a C+ student, you don't get a free. It doesn't mean you can't go just like today. It means you can't go for free. But if you can meet the threshold, and becomes an incentive. I mean, what kid wouldn't want to work to get at least a 2.5 average? And how hard is that in high school? I mean, not very. And if they're below 2.5, someone has to dig ditches. And I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. If they're going to be a goof off, and by the way, once they go to university under free federal funding, and they go to let's say they're a B plus student, they're getting a full ride. If their average drops below B plus while they're in college, they lose their funding, and they lose it for a full semester, and they have to pay their own way and earn back a 3.5 average or better to restore the funding that would have been otherwise. They lose it forever. Now, again, that doesn't mean they're expelled. It means the bill is theirs. That's as a motivation to maintain merit while they're in college. College is about two things. It's about finishing what you start and growing up. And part of growing up is it's not really learning about art history and things like that. I mean, that's all great and it's all good stuff to know. But really, most of us really learn what we're going to do for the rest of our lives when we actually start doing it. What we learn in college is how to be grown-ups. And if you can't be grown up enough to earn a 3.5 average when you're getting a full ride, or a 3.0 average when you're getting all your tuition paid for, and this is a gift from the public. If you can't maintain that, the public doesn't have to give you that gift. It is not an entitlement. It is merit-based. But what it does do is it says to anyone out there who wants to achieve, you can become a part of what will look like to those who will criticize the elite. And that's why I reject the argument that anti-politism is an elite philosophy. And how would we fund all this? Very, very simply, by shutting down everything else that the government shouldn't be doing in the first place. Really, the government should only be doing four things. It should be defending the shores, the Department of Defense, issuing sound money, which it doesn't, the Department of the Treasury, chasing down interstate criminals, the Attorney General, the FBI, and conducting foreign policy, the Department of State. Every other federal department can be shut down, and we'll have plenty of money to fund our kids going to college. Insofar as federal student loans, I would end that program. I would not forgive those loans, because to do so would be to spit on the faces of the people who worked hard and paid them off the right way. Why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense at all. You incur the debt, you owe the debt, you pay the debt. But having said all those things, that is what I believe an anti-political Congress would come to. Now remember that anti-politism, number one, is really the system of government. These ideas about education that I'm sharing with you are just ideas, and an anti-political pragmatic Congress made up of people who are not ideological and are not there to seek power might come up with some different solutions. One other little thing I want to bring up is homeschooling. As a result of this COVID situation, we have a lot of people homeschooling their children, and there are a lot of ways that homeschool children today every kid is being homeschooled as I'm recording this, learn to socialize with each other. There are associations you can belong to, teams they can join. And the argument against homeschooling, one of the arguments is that the kids will be home and subject to, not being around other kids. That's not really true. There are plenty of ways that homeschool kids get together in associations and associate with other kids. The other objection to it is always by the public teachers, and particularly those on the political left, because when you have homeschooled kids, then parents can teach them what they think is right, and then if it's in conflict with what the bureaucracy, the education bureaucracy thinks is right, they hate it. And to knock homeschooling, what they always talk about are these worst case horrible stories. Like I read one the other day about some poor girl who was on a doomsday end of world Mormon polygamous cult who was raped by her father and abused by her mother and blah blah blah. And this was the argument against homeschooling. But it's an absurd argument. What it is an argument against doomsday polygamist Mormon cults. It has nothing to do with homeschooling. Homeschooling is very successful. In fact, just today I was talking to my youngest son is thinking about, I'm not going to talk about what he's thinking about because it'll spoil a surprise for the person he's thinking about. But anyway, he's thinking about, for the first time in his life, let's just say, having children. And, he and his prospective mom-to-be, one of the things they want to do is get a bus, rehab it. This is a big thing now, and travel the country. They're both artists, and by the way, they're earning their living as artists very successfully. And that would mean by necessity homeschooling their kids. And I don't think that's a bad. Even these are my grandchildren I'm talking about. I don't think this is a bad idea. Diligent parents who work with the kids every day and make sure the kids get social contact. What's wrong with homeschooling? Nothing, as far as I can see. I don't see why the state has to have a monopoly on education. And the only argument for state monopoly in education is indoctrination. Are public schools a place where kids are indoctrinated into a certain point of view, or is that inappropriate? And I believe we are here and the government works for us. We don't work for the government. And we teach our children our values, our way, and the values of liberty and freedom. And we don't really care what the educational bureaucracy thinks is politically correct or not. The waters of the public school system have been so muddied by political correctness and the rewriting of rules that more and more parents are opting to take their kids out either to private or public education. And all that really is people voting with their children. Remember that if they're living in any school district, they're still paying property taxes. They're just writing them off as a loss. And that tells you how strongly people feel about education. And in an anti-political world, all of these special interests would lose their power, and you would have control over your children, and the money would follow the children. And that's the end of this podcast. I want to thank you very much for joining me. Remember to click on the subscribe button, click on the notification button, share the Radical Reset with your friends, and make sure that you pick up a copy of A Radical Reset, the Manifesto of Antipolitism, available to you free on Amazon Kindle if you're a Prime member, or to any e-reader that you have. And if you're not, you can buy the paperback, and I promise you it's a good read. And until next time, this is E.H. Ivins signing off.